Okay, Microsoft has created what they call the entity framework, which is basically does exactly what you have done yourself. Essentials behind this is the entity framework bridges the gap between how developers commonly manipulate various conceptual objects. Pretty much all the data objects do stuff you did yourself. The technical term for this is an object relational mapper. The main difference between the object relational mapper and a DAL is that you don't really do the behind the code scene stuff in an ORM. They help ORMs help developers to become more efficient and focused. It also reduces the amount of errors down to practically nothing. It's essentially any errors that crop up is coming from your database. One of the nice simple features of the entity framework is it's built into Visual Studio 2010 by default. No need to install anything special, no plugins, nothing, it just works. As soon as you start up, you can just click Add a New Entity Model and it'll work right for you. Okay. This is sort of a walkthrough just to show you how to do this. You can follow along, but if you get a little behind, you don't have to worry about it. This is actually the first part of the app, so don't worry if you get a little behind on this. Start up by opening Visual Studio 2010, then create a new project to start a C# console application. So it's the least amount of work to do. I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that.
Andy, I have a question. Is that also available in VB and all those other places?
Yes, this is available in VB, C++, and pretty much any other .NET language there is. If you start working with Silverlight, Ruby is fairly common to work with it for scripting and stuff. But it's a very funny syntax when you start going that way. So. All right. After you've created your C# application, just fire up the program CS, go into the main. All right. The next step is adding the entities to your project. To do this, you just need to create a new file on that. So right-click on the project itself in the Solution Explorer, and just add a new item. When the list comes up, select ADO.NET Entity Model. Data model. Kind of hard to see on this screenshot. All right, if you're starting the application from scratch, if you don't have a database in place, you'll create an empty model. This is also known as the model-first approach as opposed to the database-first approach. If there was already a database in place, you would select the Generate from Database option. Entity Framework would do its best to faithfully recreate your database based on it, although it does get a few things wrong here and there. All right, we'll just start with the model-first approach. So select an empty model. This will now create a new file canvas, completely blank. Previous versions of Entity Framework, up until 4.0, did not have this little designer in there that you could use, so you had to manually enter the XML yourself. Very time-consuming to do, worse than writing the DAO yourself. So it really never caught off until version 4. This is essentially what you'll see when you start up an empty blank project. In order to add an entity, just right-click anywhere on the design surface, which is for all the white space, click Add an Entity from the context menu. Just type the name of the entity you want, and notice how I'll attempt to pluralize it, sticking with database naming conventions. Entity sets are pretty much the collections of all the entities you have, and yeah, well, we'll come along with all the add, updates, deletes, and all the good stuff that goes with it. Showing all the adding of entities, entity sets, key properties. Notice how in the entity set, it actually tries to pluralize it properly. Occasionally it'll get it wrong, but for the most part it's right. The next step is to add properties to this. Properties are essentially the instance data of the objects themselves, all the properties you just did through the DALs. First off, there's a scalar properties, which is pretty much just the various IDs, titles, wow, I can't read this, various other things. Direct links inside that table. There's also what is called navigational properties. These are the associations between two tables. In order to add an association, just right-click on them and add association. Okay. To configure this association, you need to select both ends of where it's going to go. each end of there, in this case, it's going to be events and users. You set the multiplicity from many to one, and it'll also ask you if you want to create the navigational properties, so you can directly jump from one object to the other without having to do any queries yourself. In this case, it's going to be called creator and created events. Now, if you look closely, you can actually see that it did create a little association with notations in there. I believe this is using the pro speed. Right. Once that's all said and done, you create your own. Now let's move on to actually generating one from the model, or from the existing database. This is generally a little more useful since, at least in our case, our clients usually already have a database well established in place. We're just adding on to it. From the previous exercises, if it's not, don't worry, we can set this up in your lab. You want to make sure when if you do have the option, you would select yes, include by sensitive data in the connection string. And make sure you leave the very bottom here, class schedule entities. Make sure you name that something you can easily remember. This is going to be accessed everywhere in your code. You don't want to forget it. Right. Next up, it's going to ask you which tables, views, and all the stored procedures you want to actually bring over from your database. And it's just a good idea to check everything that goes through it. And make sure you also have pluralized and singularized generated object names checked and include foreign key columns. This will help with the navigational properties when coming across. After a small wait as it's doing its generation, you'll end up with a nice little model that looks something like this. Usually when it generates it, it's a little more skewed apart, but after moving around a little, it's much easier to see. If you notice, you also have various navigational properties. Directly go from courses to here, your course offerings, departments, all back and forth. Everything's all linked together. Now, in order to use these, you have to create build a model context. In this case, the class schedule entities. In order to access content through this, we'll just loop over, in our case, using a using statement, create the context, get the courses out of it, turn it into a list, and then just start looping over it. In this case, we're just going to write the course ID out to the console. Not exactly useful, but just a quick sort of how-to. In order to working off the navigational properties, you can actually go through, find the courses, get the first course you find, and get the department out of that. Notice you don't have to write any SQL to do this yourself. It just goes through and on it. Also, one thing you need to be careful of, it's called lazy loading. By default, lazy loading is enabled. However, if you, for whatever reason, turn it off in order to enhance performance or just save calls with the database, it would throw a null reference exception when you attempted to pull the department out here if there was nothing in there. Or in this case, the department ID. Just because you have not used an include or a load statement with it. And as I said, this is turned on by default, and loading and including won't really be covered.
What is the using syntax?
The using syntax, it's very unique. It's basically limiting it so it's creating the object you're going to be referencing inside up here, and as soon as you leave the brackets on the using statement, it'll dispose of everything. It's a cleaner syntax, but kind of make sure you don't have to worry about disposing all the objects. Everything outside of the, once you leave the using syntax, everything is destroyed.
Okay, so it's stuff.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Right, there is a caveat on this, which I had mentioned. If you don't have a department in here, it's going to start throwing null reference exceptions. Also, one thing you need to know, if there is no department in here, even if you did load it, you're going to start getting null reference exceptions as well. And each and every call you do through these objects, these navigational properties, in this case the department, makes a query to the database. If you happen to have hundreds of courses, suddenly you are making several hundred queries to the database. Not something you want to do. This is why you would, I believe it's called ahead of time, something, I can't remember. You would essentially load or include whatever you're going to be needing in your initial to list or .include, various things, in order to prevent you from making hundreds of additional queries later. Okay. there any questions? Yes.
How do you do that loading? Was it shown or
To
not?
be honest, I haven't seen it in a while.
Which one?
It's been about years,
Which
so,
one?
You mean the include or?
Yeah, the loading and including. You've actually worked on this recently, so help me on that.
Yeah, actually, all you do is, you would just say courses dot include, then in parentheses, you have a string, and you just name whatever the navigational property you want. So for a department, you would do, courses dot include, and then department for string.
Any more questions?
Okay, so we're gonna do a lab where they're actually gonna do this, Andy?
Right, we are.
Okay,